So just to introduce myself quickly, and then I'll probably go off video for the purposes of the demo. Hi, everybody. Nate Calvanese. I work at the Broad. I am the Director of Data Assets and Solutions. Within the context of AnVIL, I am very involved in the actual data ingestion process for AnVIL, essentially helping data submitters get their data into AnVIL and released to the broader research community. I do a lot of work with Kate Balcones, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. Um, yeah, so we're going to spend most of our time on an active demo, but I just wanted to do a few quick slides here to provide some context and sort of set the stage for what we're talking about today. So just for a brief agenda, I wanted to go through like a quick history of AnVIL data ingestion, not belaboring that too much. I wanted to talk a little bit about the whys behind self-service. Some of them I think are pretty obvious, but some we want to kind of double click on. And then, as I mentioned, we'll do kind of a live demo of what we've built to try to better support self-service data ingestion for AnVIL. Right. So for those unfamiliar, the AnVIL data ingestion process, um, it's data ingestion as a term is probably overloaded in the broader context here. You're going to see ingestion used in a couple of different contexts. When we talk about kind of the overarching AnVIL data ingestion process, we're really talking about like the end-to-end process from data generation to data release to the research community, right? And when we generally think about that, we think about that uh, internally as these kind of five phases that you see here. So we have data generation, which happens far upstream from the AnVIL generally, where some scientific data is being generated and is being brought to the AnVIL for the purposes of being released to the broader research community for secondary use. Um, AnVIL, or at least our part of the AnVIL, the ingestion process, is generally not super involved in that, right? We know that data is being generated, we know that it's being brought to us, but for the most part, we're not very involved there, and that's why on our kind of our color coding scheme on this, the responsibility for that step is generally on the submitter or on, a lab that the submitter is helping to coordinate to bring their data into the AnVIL. So whenever you see the yellow here, that's something that is generally sort of submitter responsibility. Blue is where the AnVIL ingestion team sort of has responsibility, and green is where it's shared. Data staging is the step where we actually start to move data that has been generated from the submitter's environment or the generator's environment into the actual AnVIL environment. And so in the original design of AnVIL ingest, we used what we called a deposit workspace. A deposit workspace was essentially like a managed cloud bucket, more or less, where people could bring their data in before it was moved through the rest of the process. The third phase, which we call data ingestion, again, not to be confusing, that is where we actually are taking data from where it's originally being staged and moving it to where it needs to be in order to be released to the researcher community. So in the original design, we used what we called release workspaces. So you would have a deposit workspace, which again, we mostly used as a cloud bucket. And very often there would be, multiple studies worth of data in there, multiple consent groups worth of data in there. And our team would be responsible for parsing that out to one or more release workspaces based on how access needed to be provisioned and stuff like that. There is a data curation and transformation step that is more current, was not really included in the original design. We have it here just for consistency in the pictures that you're going to see. But for right now, I'm going to skip past that one. The data release step, it sort of bookends this whole process, right? So there's a step where folks are registering their data in dbGaP that happens likely before any of these staging ingestion type activities are happening. But there's also a step at the end when we want to kind of connect all of the plumbing and make sure that people that have requested access through dbGaP can actually be provided access to the data where it lives in AnVIL. And so there's a process that happens that involves, telemetry files coming over from dbGaP and a few other things that we could probably do an entire presentation on. But that is a shared responsibility, right? The submitters are responsible for getting their data sets registered, while the AnVIL team is responsible for kind of getting everything hooked up so that, again, approved data access requests lead to actual access to the data in AnVIL. The second iteration of this, we transitioned to the Teradata repository as the release object as opposed to a release workspace. For folks that are unfamiliar with the Teradata Repository or TDR, I included some slides in the appendix that sort of explain what it is that we can either look through at the end or distribute after this. The main differences here from what you saw in the original iteration is one, we started calling deposit workspaces staging workspaces, not to be confusing to people, but because we sort of started to slightly change how we organize them. We went from this model of here's a deposit workspace, which is basically like a dumping ground bucket for you to put all of your data, to here's a staging workspace for you to encapsulate a single data set. Right. So groups that were bringing multiple data sets to us would receive multiple staging workspaces, one per data set, as opposed to the original model of this kind of one giant deposit workspace that we would then parse out as needed after the fact. So we changed naming convention there slightly just as the intent of those workspaces changed. And then the bigger change is that instead of moving data into a release workspace, we would move it into what we called a TDR data set. There were a number of reasons that we decided to do that. TDR has much better versioning capabilities than workspaces have. TDR is backed by BigQuery, which makes querying the tabular data much easier for things like mapping and transformation, which I'll talk about in a second. TDR is more easily supports indexing of the data for data exploration. There were kind of a number of reasons that we went in this direction. The con of moving in this direction is that TDR is admittedly a little bit less user-friendly than workspaces when it comes to actually moving data in and out of it. And so basically this entire sort of ingestion, curation, transformation process became even more so the responsibility of AnVIL. It already was generally our responsibility to take care of these steps, but it sort of transitioned from being, a somewhat manual thing that we had to do to thinking something that we needed to like actively engineer because it was a little bit more complicated than what we had been doing previously. This data curation and transformation step that I mentioned previously then becomes more important at this point because now we are actively doing additional transformations to the data to support downstream indexing, right? So this was around the time that we started to release the AnVIL Data Explorer. We came up with this findability subset schema to try to come up with the minimal metadata that we wanted to be able to search on. And so there's this fairly innocuous box here that is doing a lot of heavy lifting today, where additional transformation is happening to the data, being applied back to the TDR data set before what is called a snapshot is created, which is just a point in time view of a data set, which then becomes the thing that is released. Right. So this telemetry line that we had previously pointing at a release workspace would now be pointing at a snapshot. Which brings us to today. So self-service. So you'll notice that these two pictures look almost identical, right? The only difference between them is that we are continuing to move the submitter responsibility further to the right here. We're trying to get submitters more involved in the actual ingestion process. And where we had previously had just kind of this data ingestion line here, we've now indicated that it's self-service. And the distinction between those in this case is that what is happening here in the previous slide is a lot of internal tooling and scripting and often manual work and wrangling that our team has been responsible for. Whereas we've spent a lot of time, and what we're going to look at today is basically tools and processes and stuff that we put together that are much more user-friendly, much more self-service, where people could actively go and run some of this stuff themselves and abstract away some of the complexity that comes from working with TDR. Okay. So just to kind of put a bow on it here, some of our motivations between pushing for more self-service, there's a number of things here. One, we wanted to have a more consistent onboarding experience for submitters. We wanted to make sure that requirements for data submission were clear. The instructions for how to do various steps in the submission and ingestion process were accessible and clearly laid out. Previously, most of the content was available on the web and still is, but we were trying to move some of that closer to where people were actually doing their work. Secondly, we wanted to remove ourselves as resource bottlenecks in certain cases and basically empower data submitters to move their data through the pipeline more quickly if they're motivated to do so. Right now, we don't have an issue in terms of not being able to process all of the data sets that come through in a particular release. The consideration here is more the fact that if AnVIL is responsible for doing the ingestion for all of the data sets, depending on how things are queued up, is going to determine when we get to a particular data set. And that introduces the potential for 7-10 days go by before we get to a data set, and then we find errors, right? And that's a week and a half that we could have been spending fixing those errors that we are now just responding to. So having our team responsible for all of the ingestion activity, well, again, is not something that we haven't been able to handle, but introduces some potential lag in certain processes. The third bullet here is we really want to make sure that the people that are most familiar with the data are the ones that are looking at it and validating it before release. We do our validation internally, but it's very kind of structurally focused for the most part. I might notice something like a referential integrity issue, right? I might notice that tables don't join together like they're supposed to, but I may not notice that a sample count is lower than it's expected to be, right? Because I'm not going to be as familiar with that data set as the people that produced it. And so we want to make sure that we're giving submitters more opportunities to be closer to the data further through the process so that gets to the point when it's ready to be released, they can let us know if something looks off to them. And then the last one is, freeing up some of our time would allow us to focus more on the data curation and transformation steps, try to improve some of the data exploration processes that we're doing. It also allows us time to think about some of the things like we're talking about today around process improvements, but also the researcher experience, right? Making sure that once we've got ingestion working fairly smoothly, are we making sure that the data that is being provided to the researchers is as valuable as possible? Okay. I think we have a designated Q&A at the end, so I'll probably just keep going here. Okay. So let's look at a live demo quickly. So when folks come to us, let me get out of here. When folks come to us and want to submit data, the first thing that we need to figure out is how many staging workspaces they need. For the purposes of our demo, I'll assume that we just have, our happy path, right? We're working with one data set, very straightforward, everything's sort of encapsulated. And so we've built some workflows that will help us generate all of the cloud resources that would be required for submission. We won't go into kind of the in-depth detail here, but the important thing to note is that we have a workflow that we can run once we understand what the data set needs to be named, whether it's controlled access or not, a few other little data points like that. And when we run this workflow, what it's going to do for us is basically generate all of the cloud resources, all of the stuff that we need to hand to a data submitter for them to operate in a self-service manner. And generally that means three things, right? One, it's going to generate what we call a staging workspace. And it's going to pre-populate that staging workspace with all of the submission instructions, with all of the workflows that they need. It's going to pre-configure those workflows as best as it can to try to make it as simple and straightforward as possible for people to use. And we'll look at what that looks like in a second. The second thing it's going to create for controlled access data sets is what's called an auth domain group, which is an additional layer of security that's used in AnVIL. Again, it's another thing we could probably do, a good 15 minutes on by itself. And the third thing it's going to create is a TDR data set that is going to be pre-configured to be able to read from the staging workspace. The idea is that when submitters come in, they do all of their work in the staging workspace. They know that this TDR data set exists, but they don't need to interact with it directly because, as I mentioned before, that's not super user-friendly. It's a little more engineer-focused. So we've basically set it up so that it will be created. It will be properly set up to be able to read from the staging workspace so a user can push to it without having to worry about Google permission propagation delays and stuff like that. But all the actual work the submitter would do would be in the workspace itself. All right, so let's look at those things quickly. So this is what a staging workspace looks like when it is first created. You'll see that it's totally empty. There's no data tables. There are no files beyond like a single README file that we upload. The dashboard has been pre-populated with a bunch of instructions. We try not to put too much in here that is duplicative of other documentation that already exists. You'll see a lot of cases where we're just linking out to the AnVIL portal. or we're linking out to existing Terra support documentation, or we're linking out to DocStore for WDLs and stuff like that. But the idea is that a user could come in here, we could effectively hand them this workspace and say, like, here's pretty much what you need to do. And if you follow the steps here, you will more or less be successful in submitting your data to the AnVIL. So for the purposes of our demo today, we're going to focus kind of just on steps 4 and 5, which is actually putting data in the workspace and seeing how it would move into TDR. But we also have documentation here about, how to set up your data model, how to actually prepare your data for submission in terms of like, it needs to be formatted in a certain way. Study approvals and registration and stuff like that, stuff that for the most part would happen upstream of the actual creation of this workspace, but we just wanted to have everything here to make it, comprehensive. I mentioned 2 other things that get created. There is this authorization domain group that gets created. It gets pre-populated with a bunch of, internal groups that we have. We have an AnVIL admins group and dev group. We have the TDR ingest service account for the TDR dataset that gets created. Again, all of this stuff is done automatically to A, just facilitate the actual ingestion of the data that's going to happen, but B, make sure that like our AnVIL admins have access to all AnVIL resources that get created, and we don't end up with sort of orphaned cloud resources floating around that might be incurring costs that we can't keep our eyes on. The last thing that gets created is a TDR dataset. It very much like the workspace is pretty bare bones when it first gets created. It's literally just one table with 2 columns that has some pointers back to those things we just looked at, right? It has the staging workspace, it has the authorization group, just reference information that is present here so that if someone is looking, strictly at the TDR dataset, they can sort of understand where the data originally came from. Similarly, in the workspace, we kind of have all the same pointers, right? We have the data set that it is pointing at in TDR. We have the service account associated with that data set. We have the auth group. We're just trying in as many different ways as possible to tie all these things together so that it's easy to kind of navigate between them. Okay. So we hand a staging workspace over to a user. We have some introductory conversations with them as needed. And when they actually go to do their work, they need to do a couple of things, which I'm going to go through very quickly here. So the first thing that they need to do is they need to add in their tabular data and their data files. So give me 1 second on my other screen here. I'm just going to pull this stuff up. So, oops. All right. So for the data file, so everything that I'm going to be uploading is completely fake, just to make sure that that is totally clear. So we're going to create a folder called data files. I'm going to upload a bunch of files into this. I'm just going to do it through the UI because they're all very tiny, fake files. People could also do this via, G-Cloud storage or other mechanisms if they're dealing with bigger files. But for my purposes, this should be fine. So I'm just going to upload my 25 fake genomic file objects, which should only take a second here. And then while that's running, I will get my tabular data ready. Almost done. Cool. All right, so all of that stuff should be here. And then I'm just going to go very quickly and upload my tabular data. Again, in the instructions, we would talk about sort of, what tables you should have, how they need to be formatted, stuff like that. For our purposes, we're going to assume that the data modeling conversations have been had. We're going to assume that kind of the formatting stuff has been sorted out because we just want to demonstrate kind of what these workspaces look like at different stages. So I've uploaded 2 files that go to the sample table. I'm going to upload a subject table. And lastly, I'm going to upload a data types test file. So if we look at these quickly in Terra, we have a subject table for 25 different subjects. We have some consent information, ethnicity, sex, where they were sequenced, um, a couple of sort of base information about the subject or the donor themselves. In the sample table, we have 30 rows. You can see 25 of them are going to be referencing those 25 fake crams that I uploaded. And then we have 5 that don't have file references. In our referencing subjects that we don't have in the subject table. We did this purposefully to demonstrate some of the data validation stuff in a second. And then we have this data type test table that we would never expect a group to submit, but we use this to basically try to break some of the workflows that we're going to look at today, where we format data in a whole bunch of different ways that Terra supports to kind of see how it comes through on the other end in TDR. So we have stuff like using arrays, we have mixed integers and strings, we have mixed strings and arrays. We have all sorts of different combinations, not terribly important, but we just included it as the demo to just show kind of what some of this looks like on the other side when we run it through into TDR. All right. So the next thing that people generally do is if they don't have a file table, we've provided a workflow to help them build a file manifest. That's the first of the workflows that we'll look at. So in this staging workspace, we have 4 currently workflows that are going to be preloaded for you and are going to be pre-configured. And when I mean that they're pre-configured, I'm going to click on this file manifest one. And if you go down into the actual inputs, you're going to see it's all already actually filled out for you. So it's already pointing at the proper billing project in Workspace. It's using the proper Docker image. It already has some base strings to exclude, which is just saying, I don't want these things included in my file manifest. There's a couple of other additional things that you could change or tweak, but assuming we're on our happy path here, a user should be able to come in here and not have to change anything and just click launch and the workflow would run. Now, in the interest of time, because workflows take a little bit to run, we have this pre-staging workspace and we also have this post-staging workspace, which we're going to use to look at stuff kind of after it has been done. So in this case, we would run that workflow. It would add another table to our workspace for file metadata, which just has a list of the files that are present in the bucket and a bunch of metadata about them, right? MD5s, their size, their names, etc., file extensions. There are reasons that this is important that we don't probably have time to get into today, but we just wanted to demonstrate the fact that, this is an example of like one basic tool that we can provide to people if they don't want to build their own file table. We have a mechanism that they can do it through a workflow in that staging workspace. The next thing that we would generally do is start to do some validation of our data. So once it is in the workspace, and we're going to do most of our work in the post one here now, just in the interest of time. Once we have our data tables set up, once we have our data files in place, we generally want to do some validation of the data to make sure it sort of looks as we expect. The way that we do that today is we have a data dictionary format that we request from people. That format is being evolved currently in our partnership with Vanderbilt. So the version that you see today might not look exactly like the version that you'll see, a week from now even. But we're still going to take a look at that quickly. So we have folks provide a data dictionary, which gives us some expectation of what the tabular data in the workspace should look like. And then we have another workflow that will run that will compare that data dictionary to the actual data in the workspace and spit out a bunch of information about what looks wrong, what potentially needs to be looked at or corrected. So let me move a few things from the other screen. So the actual workflow itself is called Terra Summary Statistics. And it has 2 modes in which it runs. One, you cannot provide it a data dictionary file, so I could leave this empty. And what it will do is it will generate just some base summary statistics about the data in the data tables, and it will output it in a format that looks like this. Let me make this a little bit bigger. The reason that we included this functionality is we know there will be some groups that don't find it super easy to create a data dictionary. And so by running this workflow in this mode, we essentially can give them like a template. We can say, here are all your tables, here's all your columns, here's sort of what data types we're inferring from them Here's some summary statistics about them, record counts, null counts, unique value counts, sort of like the normal counting stats that you would see for data. And then they can go in and fill in things like descriptions and human readable labels and which fields are primary keys and which fields are foreign keys and stuff like that. It's just another way that we're trying to uh, help make the process just a little bit easier for submitters. So let me get rid of this one. Conversely, if I did have a data dictionary, which we have instructions for in all that documentation we looked at, I could provide a file that looked something like this. And like I said, this format itself is going to evolve, but in general, the types of things that we're capturing are going to be mostly the same, right? What are my tables? What are the columns in my tables? What's like a human readable label for that column or that variable? What's a more comprehensive text description for it? Which columns are primary keys? Which are foreign keys, meaning that they refer to a column in a different table? Which columns are required? What are the data types? Which columns allow multiple values, meaning they can be arrays? If there are certain allowed values for a column, what are they? If it's a short enough list that you can list them out, we accept that. If it's something where we need to use a regex pattern or something like that because it's like a really comprehensive list and you don't want to have to include everything in here, we also support that. And then we support also any other number of columns people want to include. Essentially, we have a set of required columns that are actually used by the workflow. And then if folks want to add a bunch of other stuff that they think might be useful to researchers, they can, and it'll be preserved when that workflow runs. And so the second mode that this validation workflow has allows you to input a data dictionary file. And if you do, it will then output something that looks like this. So this should look from here to about here, should look identical to what we just looked at. It's the same exact input data dictionary, all the same information. What's new is that we've now tacked on a bunch of stuff at the end, right? So we've inferred the data type on our end. So not just trusting explicitly what you told us, but saying, based on what we're seeing in the table, this is what we think the data type is. We've inferred what the multiple values allowed field should be. So if you told us a field should not be an array, but you have array values in there, we would infer that to be an array field, right? All the same counting stats that we looked at before, record counts, null counts, unique value counts. But then also a bunch of data validation items here, these last four columns. So value not in a ref call count basically says if you have a column that you say should be a foreign key to another column in a different table, if you have values in that column that are not in the referenced column, we would raise that, right? We'd say, oh, hey, this is something you need to look at. If you have values that don't match those allowed lists. So if you provided an allow list or you provided an allowed value pattern and you have values that violate that list or that pattern, again, you would end up with some records here. And then we flag a bunch of stuff based on not just these two fields, but also some of the other information that we have collected. So the list of things that we're flagging for here, just to kind of run through them quickly, the allowed value list and allowed value pattern adherence, which we just talked about. So if you have values that violate that allowed value list or pattern, we will flag that and we'll give you a note that basically says exactly that. We have referential integrity checks. So if you're referencing a table or field that doesn't exist, or you have values that don't exist in a reference field, again, we're going to call that out. So this is a case where the reference table is not in the workspace. We have another example somewhere. Yeah, so this column contains values not in the reference column. We do data type match checks. So if the data types don't match between what we're inferring and what you've provided, we probably want to take a look at that. Or if you're using a data type that's sort of outside of our expected list, we want to take a look at that. Array status checks. So again, if you told us something should be an array and it isn't, or vice versa, we would flag that. Required field checks. If you told us something is required and it has nulls, we want to flag that. And then just a general data dictionary versus data table sort of mismatch. So if there are fields in the dictionary that aren't in the table or vice versa, we would just call those things out as well, right? So here's an example where there's a bunch of columns that are in the workspace but are not in the data dictionary. And these are things we would generally want to be resolved. Uh, the idea with this is that it would be sort of an iterative process submitters could go through where they can submit their data, submit the data dictionary that goes along with it, run the validation workflow, get some feedback, correct things that need to be corrected, accepting that there might be some quirks in the data that just need, just happen to be there or need to be there for whatever reason. And then once they are happy with how their data looks, more or less, we have the final sort of push to TDR workflow, which is this one here. It is, again, generally pretty straightforward and pre-configured for users. So I could come in here and just launch this without having to change a single thing. If for some reason I want to take advantage of some of the functionality that TDR has and do certain different things and run things in different ways, we tried to surface a bunch of the different options here in the workflow so more advanced users had that ability. But again, for the most part, you could just come in here and launch things exactly as they exist. It's already pointing at the appropriate data set. It's already sort of, pre-populated how it should run in terms of, should I truncate things that already exist? Our default is no. If you wanted to, you can flip it over, etc. So we launched this workflow, and what it's going to do is it's going to take the data that exists here in the workspace and it is going to push it into TDR. And so if we look at the TDR data set associated with the post staging workspace, you'll see that it looks very different, right? Whereas this one was just one table with two columns, not much stuff in here. This now includes all of the tables that we saw in the workspace, in addition to that ingestion reference table. Each of those tables will have all of the columns, it'll have all the data types and things that we've inferred. Anywhere where there were file references, there will now be proper TDR file IDs that reference them. So that's these UUIDs that you see here. And so if we were to do a quick look sort of comparison between what's here in TDR and what's in the workspace, it should look virtually identical, right? And then for the purposes of the submitter, their work is more or less done, right? We expect them to kind of maybe come in here and poke around and make sure that, again, things look like what they'd expect, that record counts sort of match what they'd expect, that the values they're seeing are sort of the values they expect to see. But for all intents and purposes, their cut of data now exists in TDR, and they could hand things off to our team to do our additional mapping and transformation work, which again is another thing that we could probably do a whole demo on. But they, by doing this sort of push into TDR, have saved us the work of having to essentially figure out how to do that ourselves and how to validate that ourselves in a way that lets us know that, okay, this is how I expect the data to look. It's ready to move forward, right? Right now, when we run the workflows, we basically are forced to go back to the submitters after the fact and say like, hey, can you carve out some time to go look for this? And, sometimes they're able to do that quickly, sometimes they're not. So it just adds another kind of handoff that we're trying to avoid. Cool. All right. So I wanted to go through that relatively quickly because I wanted to save time for questions and potentially, poke around at stuff as folks are interested. So why don't we shift over to that and you all let me know what questions you have.